What I'm about to tell you has been buried in sealed court documents, hidden in crumbling parish records, and deliberately erased from family histories for nearly a century. This is the story of a bloodline that destroyed itself from within, a forbidden union that violated every law of God and man, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of British society. The documents don't lie, though many have tried to make them disappear. In the winter of 1933, in a manor house outside the village of Ashbourne in Derbyshire, something unspeakable was happening behind closed doors. The Pemberton family, once celebrated members of the landed gentry with a lineage stretching back to the Norman conquest, were about to become the subject of the most disturbing scandal in English county history. But this wasn't a scandal that would make headlines. This was a scandal that would be suffocated in silence, buried under threats and payoffs, hidden so thoroughly that even today, most people have never heard the name Pemberton. There's a reason for that. By the time authorities finally breached the doors of Ashbourne Manor on March 17, 1933, 3 people were dead, 2 had vanished, and the evidence they discovered would cause a senior police inspector to resign rather than continue the investigation. What was in that house? What had the Pembertons been doing for years, perhaps decades, behind those ivy-covered walls? And why did everyone from the local magistrate to members of Parliament work so frantically to ensure the truth never reached the public? Before we descend into the darkness of this story, I need you to understand something. Every fact I'm presenting comes from documented sources, parish records, court transcripts that were sealed until 2008, medical examiner reports discovered in estate sales. This isn't folklore or legend. This happened, and it was hidden deliberately. If you're drawn mysteries that reveal the disturbing truths lurking beneath respectable facades, subscribe to Whispers of Mystery right now. What we're about to explore together will challenge everything you thought you knew about how far people will go to protect their bloodline and their secrets. The Pemberton family's downfall began, oddly enough, with what appeared to be a blessing. In 1911, Lord Edmund Pemberton, the 8th Baron Ashbourne, married Lady Catherine Hartwell in what was described by the Times as a union of impeccable breeding and substantial fortune. Catherine brought with her a dowry of considerable size and connections to 3 other noble families. Edmund, 31 years old and by all accounts a handsome, educated gentleman, seemed destined for a life of comfortable aristocratic obscurity, managing his estates, serving as a local magistrate, perhaps taking a seat in the House of Lords someday. They had their first child in 1913, a daughter named Eleanor. A son, Thomas, followed in 1915, born while Edmund was serving in France during the Great War. Edmund returned from the war in 1916, invalided out after sustaining injuries at the Somme. According to military records, he'd taken shrapnel to his left leg and suffered from what was then called shell shock. He walked with a pronanceur for the rest of his life, and servants would later testify that he frequently woke screaming in the night. But Edmund came home to a growing family and a wife who, by all accounts, managed the estate brilliantly during his absence. A third child, a daughter named Margaret, was born in 1917. And here, in what seemed like a normal, even admirable family of the English upper class, the seeds of something terrible were already being sown. I need you to pay attention to the timeline now, because this is where the documented facts begin to paint a picture that will make your skin crawl. In 1918, Catherine's younger sister, Victoria Hartwell, came to live at Ashbourne Manor. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and according to letters discovered in 2009, she'd suffered a nervous breakdown after the death of her fiancé in the war. The family took her in, as families did. Victoria was given rooms in the east wing of the manor. She would live there for the next 15 years, and according to household staff testimony taken in 1933, she rarely left the grounds. Now, large country houses often had relatives staying for extended periods. This wasn't unusual with the details that emerged later about Victoria's living arrangements. A housemaid named Agnes Porter, who worked at Ashbourne Manor from 1919 to 1925, gave a statement to police in April of 1933. I'm reading directly from the transcript now, which was sealed for 75 years. Miss Victoria's rooms were kept locked from the outside. Lady Catherine held the only key. We were instructed never to enter unless Lady Catherine was present. When we did enter for cleaning, always on Thursday mornings, Miss Victoria would stand facing the wall until we finished. She never spoke to us. She never looked at us. Once I saw bruising on her arms, dark bruises like fingerprints. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, I was told to forget what I'd seen or I'd be dismissed without references. Let me repeat that. Victoria's rooms were locked from the outside. She was kept, essentially, as a prisoner in her own sister's home. But the household staff didn't report this because losing their position without references meant destitution in 1920s England. They kept quiet. They had families to feed. The children grew. Thomas and Margaret were educated at home by a governess until 1925, when Eleanor was sent to a finishing school in Switzerland. This was normal for daughters of the aristocracy. Thomas was sent here, again perfectly normal. But Margaret, the youngest, remained at home. The reason given was that she was frail, prone to illness. A local doctor, Dr. Henry Ashworth, treated her regularly for what he described in his notes as nervous complaints and general constitutional weakness. Dr. Ashworth's medical records were subpoenaed during the investigation. He'd been visiting the manor at least twice weekly from 1925 onward. His notes are chilling in what they don't say. Entry after entry describes Margaret's symptoms: lethargy, melancholy, refusal to eat, nightmares. Never a specific treatment beyond sedatives and tonics. It's what we call now a pattern of documentation designed to create a paper trail that says nothing. In 1928, Eleanor returned from Switzerland. She was 17 years old, accomplished in French and music, expected to debut in London society and make a suitable marriage. She never debuted. According to her father's correspondence with his man of business, a Mr. Gerald Whitmore, Eleanor suffered a crisis of nerves within 3 weeks of returning home. She became, in Edmund's words, or manageable. A specialist from London was called, a Dr. Philip Cavendish, who specialized in female nervous disorders. Dr. Cavendish's report still exists. It's brief and damning in its vagueness. Miss Pemberton suffered from acute hysteria and delusions. She has made allegations of the most serious nature which have no basis in fact and appear to stem from a diseased imagination. I recommend isolation, rest, and treatment with sedatives until her reason returns. Under no circumstances should she be allowed contact with persons outside the immediate family, as her delusions cause considerable embarrassment and harm to the family's reputation. What were these allegations? The report doesn't say. But Eleanor never left Ashbourne Manor again. Now we have 2 women, Victoria and Eleanor, essentially imprisoned in this house. The evidence suggests Margaret, though not explicitly confined, was kept in a state of drugged compliance. Thomas was away at school, then at Cambridge, conveniently absent from the house for most of the year. The local village of Ashbourne had a population of roughly 400 people. In villages that size, everyone knows everyone's business. But when police interviewed villagers in 1933, they encountered a wall of silence punctuated by carefully vague statements. The Pembertons kept to themselves. We didn't see much of the family. It wasn't our place to ask questions. One woman, a widow named Martha Keane who'd sold eggs to the manor house for years, said something more revealing. One knew something wasn't right up there. But Lord Pemberton controlled half the livelihoods in this village. You didn't cross him. You didn't ask questions. You took your money and you kept your mouth shut. This is how evil persists. Not through dramatic villainy, but through economic control and social pressure. Through people choosing survival over speaking truth. In 1930, something happened that caused a crack in the manor's facade. A new vicar arrived in Ashbourne, a man named Reverend James Blackwood. He was young, 32 years old, fresh from a parish in Yorkshire, and by all accounts he took his pastoral duties seriously. Parish records show he attempted to visit Ashbourne Manor on several occasions to introduce himself to the family and invite them to services. He was turned in November of 1930. He received a letter. It was unsigned, delivered by hand to the vicarage in the middle of the night. The letter still exists in church archives. I've seen a photograph of it. The handwriting is shaky, desperate. They are keeping us prisoner. 3 women in this house have no freedom, no voice. We are being used in ways that God himself would condemn. Please help us escape. The doors are locked. He watches everything. Please. Reverend Blackwood took this letter to the local police constable, a man named William Frost. Constable Frost was 58 years old, nearing retirement, and he'd lived in Ashbourne his entire life. He read the letter. According to Blackwood's diary, discovered after his death in 1967, Frost's response was, "Reverend, I'd advise you to burn that letter and forget you saw it. Lord Pemberton is not a man to be crossed. If there were anything truly wrong at the manor, I'd know about it. This is likely a prank, or perhaps one has an overly dramatic temperament. These upper-class women sometimes get strange ideas. Best leave it alone." Blackwood didn't leave it alone. In January of 1931, he went to the manor himself unannounced and demanded to speak with Lady Catherine. He was admitted, surprisingly. Catherine met with him in the drawing room. Their conversation lasted 20 minutes. A Blackwood's diary entry from that evening reads, "I have met with Lady Catherine. She explained that both her sister and her daughter Eleanor suffer from severe mental afflictions and must be kept in controlled circumstances for their own safety. She showed me letters from physicians confirming this. She was gracious, reasonable, and her concern for her family seemed genuine. Yet I cannot shake a feeling of deep unease. There was something in her eyes, a coldness, a calculation. I fear I have made a grave error in not pressing harder. But what authority do I have? What proof? A single anonymous letter against the word of a baronet's wife and multiple doctors. God forgive me if I have failed these women." He had failed them. But he was trapped in the same system that trapped everyone else. What could avert against a powerful family with medical documentation and legal authority? The year 1931 passed, then 1932. From the outside, Ashbourne Manor appeared as it always had, a grand country house with smoke rising from its chimneys, lights in the windows, servants coming and going. But inside those walls, something was festering. Something so fundamentally wrong that when it finally came to light, grown men would weep at the evidence. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. We're about to go deeper, and I promise you the truth is more disturbing than anything you're imagining. In February of 1933, Thomas Pemberton returned from Cambridge. He was 20 years old, reading history, by all accounts a bright young man with prospects. He'd been away at university since 1929, coming home only for brief holidays. But in February of 1933 he came home for what was supposed to be a month-long break before his final term. He lasted 3 days before he fled the house in the middle of the night, and went directly to Reverend Blackwood. What Thomas told the car that night set in motion the events that would finally expose Ashbourne Manor's secrets. Blackwood's diary entry from February 8, 1933, is the most detailed he ever wrote. 6 full pages in his cramped handwriting. Thomas Pemberton came to the vicarage at 2:30 this morning, nearly hysterical. He was filthy, having apparently climbed out a window and run across the fields in the dark. He begged for sanctuary. The words he spoke were so horrifying that I initially thought he must be suffering from some form of madness himself. But he was coherent, specific, and increasingly desperate. He claims that his father and mother have been engaged in acts of such depravity that I can scarcely write them down. He says his Aunt Victoria and his sister Eleanor have been kept as prisoners, not due to madness, but because they tried to resist what was being done to them. He says his sister Margaret has been drugged into submission. And he says, God help us all, that the bloodline has been corrupted, that children have been born and died in that house, that the family tree has twisted back upon itself in ways that violate every law of God and nature. Thomas told Blackwood that his father, Lord Edmund Pemberton, had been engaging in incestuous relations with his own daughters. That Victoria had been brought to the manor not as a guest, but as a breeding vessel, forced to bear Edmund's children to keep the bloodline pure. That Eleanor, after returning from Switzerland, had discovered the truth about her aunt and had been drugged and confined when she threatened to expose everything. That Margaret had been groomed from childhood for the same fate. Thomas claimed he discovered all of this upon returning home, when he'd heard screaming from the locked east wing and had stolen his mother's keys while she slept. He'd found Eleanor and Victoria sharing a room, both inly malnourished. Eleanor had grabbed him, begged him to get help, told him everything. She'd told him about the babies born in secret, delivered by Dr. Ashworth, who was paid handsomely for his silence. She'd told him about the children who'd died, buried somewhere on the estate without names or markers. She'd told him that their mother, Lady Catherine, wasn't a victim but an active participant, believing that keeping the bloodline concentrated would preserve their family's superiority and fortune. Blackwood didn't sleep that night. He kept Thomas at the vicarage, and in the morning, he didn't go to Constable Frost. He went directly to Derby, to the county police headquarters, and demanded to speak with the highest ranking officer available. He spoke with Inspector Charles Hartley, a man with 30 years of experience. Hartley listened to Blackwood's account. He read the entries from Blackwood's diary. He interviewed Thomas personally. And then, remarkably, Hartley believed them, or at least he believed them enough to investigate. On February 11, 1933, Inspector Hartley, accompanied by 4 constables and a police surgeon, arrived at Ashbourne Manor with a warrant to search the premises and interview all residents. This warrant was issued by a magistrate from Derby, not the local magistrate, who happened to be Lord Pemberton's personal friend. What they found inside Ashbourne Manor would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives. The official police report runs to 43 pages. It was classified immediately after being filed and wasn't declassified until 2008, 75 years later, when the law required it. I've read the entire report. I've read the witness statements. I've seen the photographs, though I wish I hadn't. What I'm about to tell you is drawn directly from these documents. When police entered the manor, they were initially met with cooperation. Lady Catherine composed and ushered them in. Lord Edmund, leaning on his cane, was indignant but civil. He demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion. Inspector Hartley presented the warrant and insisted on seeing Victoria Hartwell and Eleanor Pemberton immediately. Catherine claimed both women were resting, that they were unwell and shouldn't be disturbed. Hartley insisted. Catherine went to retrieve keys from her study. While she was gone, Lord Edmund attempted to quietly leave the room. A constable blocked his path. Edmund became agitated, demanding to know if he was being detained in his own home. Catherine returned with keys. The police followed her to the east wing, up a narrow servants' staircase, to a corridor with 3 doors. All 3 were locked from the outside with barrel bolts in addition to key locks. Catherine unlocked the first door. The smell that emerged, according to multiple statements, was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, chamber pots that hadn't been emptied, something else underneath that the police surgeon later identified as infection and illness. Inside the room were Eleanor and Victoria. They were on a single bed, clutching each other. Both women were emaciated. Their nightgowns were stained and torn. Eleanor's hair, which in photographs from 1928 had been long and lustrous, was now chopped short and matted. Victoria appeared much older than her 37 years. Both women had bruises in various stages of healing on their arms, legs and faces. When Inspector Hartley spoke to them, Eleanor began screaming. Victoria remained silent, rocking back and forth. The police surgeon examined both women on the spot. His report is clinical and devastating. Both showed signs of prolonged malnourishment. Both had healed fractures that had never been properly set. Both had scarring consistent with repeated physical abuse. And both showed physical evidence of recent sexual assault. The surgeon's conclusion: these women have been subjected to systematic torture, imprisonment, and sexual violence over a period of years. Margaret was found in another room in the main part of the house. She was 17 years old. She appeared drugged, barely responsive. Her room was unlocked but heavily curtained, dim even in daylight. On her bedside table were multiple bottles of laudanum and chloral hydrate, dated and prescribed by Dr. Ashworth. The police surgeon's examination of Margaret found evidence of repeated pregnancy and childbirth. At 17 years old, this girl had given birth at least twice. Inspector Hart Edmund and Lady Catherine Pemberton on the spot, charged with imprisonment, assault, and rape. Dr. Henry Ashworth was arrested at his home that same evening. The house was searched thoroughly. And this is where the story descends into an even deeper hell. In the cellar of Ashbourne Manor, behind wine racks that had to be dismantled, police found a locked door. Behind that door was a small room, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls and no windows. In that room were 4 small wooden boxes, roughly 2 feet long each. Inside those boxes were the skeletal remains of infants. None could have been more than a few months old at death. The police surgeon estimated they'd been there for varying amounts of time, the oldest perhaps 10 years, the newest perhaps 2 years. In the estate's private cemetery, which held marked graves of Pemberton family members going back 200 years, police used ground-penetrating equipment, crude by today's standards but effective enough, to search for unmarked graves. They found 3 sites with disturbances consistent with burial. They exhumed 2 of them. One contained the remains of an infant approximately 1 year old at death. The other contained the remains of a child approximately 4 years old. Neither had coffins. Both had been wrapped in cloth and buried without ceremony or marker. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse spanning at least a decade, possibly longer. Victoria Hartwell had brought to Ashbourne Manor in 1918 and had been systematically raped by her brother-in-law with her sister's full knowledge and cooperation. She'd given birth to at least 2 children. One had died in infancy, likely from neglect or illness. The fate of the other was never determined. Possibly it was one of the skeletal remains found, or possibly it had survived and been hidden elsewhere. Eleanor, upon returning from Swifthead in 1928, had been intended as the next victim. She'd resisted, had fought, had threatened to go to authorities. She'd been declared insane by complicit doctors, confined, and systematically broken through drugs, starvation, and assault. By 1933, she'd given birth to at least 1 child which had died. Whether the child died naturally or was killed was never determined. Margaret, groomed from childhood and kept compliant with drugs, had given birth twice by age 17. 1 child, apparently healthy, had been sent away. Police traced this child to an orphanage in Manchester, placed there under a false name with a substantial financial endowment. The child was 3 years old in 1933, a girl named Alice, who had no idea of her true parentage. The other child Margaret bore had died and was buried in the unmarked cemetery plot. The medical evidence suggested at least 3 other pregnancies between the 3 women that had either ended in miscarriage or resulted in infants who died shortly after birth. Dr. Ashworth's private records, seized from his home, he'd attended at least 6 births at Ashbourne Manor between 1925 and 1932. None of these births were registered. None had legal documentation. All were paid for in cash. Substantial amounts that made Ashworth a wealthy man. The motive behind this horror was laid out in documents found in Lord Edmund's private study, letters to other families with similar concerns about bloodline purity, books on eugenics, on selective breeding, on maintaining aristocratic lineages, a journal in Edmund's handwriting that detailed his belief that the Pemberton bloodline was being diluted by marriages to inferior stock, that the family's historic greatness could only be preserved through what he called concentrated breeding. His journal contained calculations, bloodline charts that twisted back on themselves, theories about genetic superiority that had no basis in science but made perfect sense to his diseased mind. Lady Catherine's role was fully collaborative. Her letters, her diaries, showed she believed as her husband that their bloodline must be kept pure. She viewed her own sister as a vessel, her daughters as broodmares. She documented the births, the deaths, with cold efficiency. Her diary entry from after 1 infant died, the child was weak, probably from E's poor constitution. We must try again. The bloodline demands perfection. These were not crimes of passion or madness. These were calculated, systematic crimes carried out over years with the full cooperation of 2 educated, intelligent, sane individuals who believed they were doing something righteous. That's what makes this case so profoundly disturbing. This wasn't an abusive drunk beating his family. This was aristocratic eugenics taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. We're about to reveal what happened during the trial and why this case was buried so thoroughly. But first, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. Lord Edmund and Lady Catherine Pemberton were charged with multiple counts of rape, incest, unlawful imprisonment, manslaughter and child destruction. Dr. Henry Ashworth was charged an accessory to all counts. The case should have been the trial of the century. It should have dominated headlines. Instead, it became the trial that never happened. Within 2 weeks of the arrests, pressure began mounting on the prosecution. Multiple members of Parliament, some of whom were distant relatives of the Pemberton family, some of whom simply moved in the same social circles, began making inquiries. Not public inquiries, private ones, conversations in clubhouses, visits to the Director of Public Prosecutions, letters to the Home Secretary. The message was clear: this case was an embarrassment to the entire aristocratic class. It made all upper-class families look suspect. It would fuel public resentment against inherited privilege and old money. The Hartwell family, Victoria's birth family, hired an army of solicitors. Their goal wasn't to support Victoria, but to suppress the case. They argued that Victoria's testimony would be unreliable given her mental state, that dragging the family name through a public trial would serve no purpose, that the entire affair should be handled quietly. In March of 1903, the arrests, Dr. Henry Ashworth was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. He'd used his bedsheet. No suicide note was found. Guards claimed they checked on him 30 minutes before and he'd been fine. The inquest ruled suicide while the balance of mind was disturbed. Many observers noted that Ashworth's death was remarkably convenient, as his testimony would have been crucial to the prosecution's case. In April of 1933, Lord Edmund Pemberton was examined by 3 psychiatric specialists appointed by the court. All 3 concluded he was suffering from advanced neurocephalus, a disease he'd likely contracted during the war, which had progressively damaged his brain over the years. They declared him unfit to stand trial. His mental capacity to understand the charges against him or assist in his own defense. He was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where he would spend the rest of his life. The neurosyphilis diagnosis was convenient. Too convenient. Yes, Edmund had served in the war, and yes, syphilis was common among soldiers. But his journal entries, his letters, all showed a clear, calculating mind right up until his arrest. The psychiatric evaluation smells of manipulation, of doctors being told what diagnosis would be most expedient. But once he was declared insane and committed, he couldn't be tried. The case against him effectively died. That left Lady Catherine. She was the only defendant who could still stand trial, and her trial would have revealed everything. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. They had the victim's testimony. They had the physical evidence. They had the bodies of dead children. They had documents in Catherine's own handwriting proving her full participation. In May of 1933, the prosecution offered Catherine a deal. The details of this deal were sealed, but the outcome was public record. Catherine would plead guilty to 1 count of unlawful imprisonment and 1 count of child neglect. All other charges would be dropped. In exchange for this plea, she would receive a sentence of 12 years in prison, and all evidence gathered during the investigation would be sealed for 75 years. The case would be reported in newspapers only in the most general terms, with no graphic details released to the public. Why did the prosecution agree to this? Political pressure, certainly, but also practical considerations. A Victoria Hart mental condition that testifying in a lengthy public trial might destroy her completely. Eleanor was barely better. Margaret was still a minor, still heavily traumatized. Putting these women on the stand, subjecting them to cross-examination by defense solicitors who would do everything possible to discredit them, seemed cruel. And there was no guarantee of conviction on the most serious charges. British juries in 1933 were hesitant to convict aristocratic women of serious crimes, often assuming the woman must have been dominated by a man. Catherine accepted the deal. She was sentenced to 12 years at Holloway Prison in London. She served 8 years, released early in 1941 for good behaviour. She died in 1953 at age 64, living quietly in a small house in Cornwall under an assumed name. She never expressed remorse. She never spoke publicly about what she'd done. She took her justifications, her twisted beliefs, to her grave. What happened to the victims tells you everything about how completely this case was covered up and how little justice they received. Victoria Hartwell was institutionalized at a private sanatorium in Scotland, paid for by the Hartwell Family Trust. She remained there until her death in 1958, never recovering from her trauma. She never spoke another word after being removed from Ashbourne Manor. Complete psychological collapse. Eleanor Pemberton was also institutionalized at a facility in Wales. She lived until 1971, dying at age 58. Hospital records show she suffered from severe depression, paranoia, and would now be diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. She attempted suicide multiple times. She was kept heavily medicated for most of her institutionalized life. She never married, and never had any life outside those walls. Margaret Pemberton was the only one who had a chance at recovery because she was young enough when rescued. She was placed in the care of a distant aunt who lived in Scotland and knew nothing of the scandal. Her identity was changed. She was told her parents had died in an accident. She received extensive medical and psychological care. She eventually married, had children, lived until 2003. But according to her daughter, interviewed in 2010 for a documentary that was never completed, Margaret never spoke about her early life, suffered from nightmares her entire life, and had periods of deep depression that would last for months. The trauma marked her forever. Thomas Pemberton, the young man who'd exposed the horror, fared little better. He was hailed briefly as courageous, then quickly became an embarrassment to everyone involved. He couldn't return to Cambridge. The scandal, though suppressed, was known in certain circles, and he was quietly asked to leave. He couldn't use his family name without suspicion. He enlisted in the army in 1938, served in the Second World War, and was killed in action during the Italian campaign. He was 29 years old. In his effects was a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to Reverend Blackwood. I did the right thing, I know I did, but I've been punished for it every day since. No one wants to know the man who exposed his own family's evil. I am a pariah. Sometimes I think it would have been better if I'd kept silent and let myself go mad pretending not to know. Reverend James Blackwood remained in Ashbourne until 1936, when he requested a transfer to another parish. His superiors, whose diary entries from 1933 to 1936 make painful reading. He was ostracised by the village. People blamed him for bringing scandal to Ashbourne. Shops wouldn't serve him, congregants stopped attending services. He'd done the right thing, and his reward was isolation and resentment. He died in 1967, and in his final diary entry, written 2 days before a stroke killed him, he wrote, I have spent 34 years asking myself if I did enough, or if I did too much, or if I did anything right at all. Those women suffered for years while I was a stone's throw away, and when I finally acted, I set in motion events that destroyed lives, including theirs. Is that justice? Is that righteousness? I will meet God soon, so don't know the answer. Ashbourne Manor was sold in 1935 to settle the Pemberton estate's debts and legal fees. The buyer demolished it in 1937. Today, there's a housing estate on the land. Most people living there have no idea what once stood there. The village of Ashbourne still exists, population now around 600. Older residents, when pressed, will admit they've heard rumours about something that happened at the manor long ago, but details are vague. The collective memory has been deliberately erased. The child who was sent to the orphanage, Alice, was adopted by a family in Manchester in 1936. She grew up never knowing her true parentage. She lived a normal life, married, had children of her own. In 2009, after the documents were unsealed, a genealogist contacted her, now a woman in her 70s, and told her the truth about where she came from. Her response, reported in a newspaper interview, was, I wish you'd never told me. I had a good life, a normal life. Now I know my bloodline is twisted and evil. How do I tell my children? How do I tell my grandchildren? That genealogist thought he was giving me answers, but he took away my peace. That's the final cruelty of this case. Even the survivors who escaped, who built new lives, were marked forever by what happened at Ashbourne Manor. Now, why was this case buried so thoroughly? The official reason was to protect the victims' privacy, to spare them further trauma. That's partially true. But the British establishment in 1933 was terrified of what this case represented. The Pembertons weren't an aberration. They were an extreme example of beliefs that were disturbingly common in aristocratic circles. Eugenics was respectable science in the 1930s. Beliefs about bloodline purity, about breeding superior stock, were openly discussed in universities and published in journals. The British upper classes were obsessed with lineage and pedigree. They bred horses and dogs according to eugenic principles. Why not people? The Pembertons simply these ideas to their logical conclusion, turned the principles of livestock breeding onto their own family. If the Pemberton case had been fully exposed, with all its details made public, it would have forced British society to confront the horror at the end of the eugenic path. It would have connected respected, mainstream ideas about genetic superiority directly to incest, rape, and dead children. The establishment couldn't allow that connection to be made so explicitly, so the case was buried, the details were sealed, and eugenic beliefs continue to be respectable until the Nazis made them politically impossible to defend. The documents don't lie, but they can be hidden. And they were hidden successfully for 75 years. I want to be clear about something. This story isn't about a few evil individuals. It's about a system that enabled evil. Every person who suspected something was wrong but stayed silent. Every servant who saw bruises and said nothing. Every villager who accepted money and didn't ask questions. Every doctor who wrote vague reports instead of clear diagnoses. Every official who accepted the convenient explanations. Every politician who pressured prosecutors to soften the case. Every newspaper editor who agreed to minimal coverage. Every person who decided that protecting reputation and avoiding scandal was more important than protecting 3 women and multiple children. That system murdered Victoria, Eleanor, and Margaret almost as surely as if it had put guns to their heads. Those women survived physically, but they never escaped that house. Not really, and the babies who died, the infants buried without names in that cellar and that cemetery, they had no chance at all, because everyone who might have saved them chose silence instead. Ashbourne Manor is gone now. The Pemberton name has faded into obscurity. But the mechanisms that allowed this horror to continue for so many years, those mechanisms are still with us. economic coercion that keeps witnesses silent, systemic bias that protects the powerful, professional complicity that values reputation over truth, social pressure that punishes whistleblowers. These things haven't disappeared. They've just become more sophisticated. What I'm about to tell you should disturb you more than anything else in this story. In 2011, 2 years after the documents were unsealed and scattered journalists began investigating the Pemberton case, several attempts were made to produce documentaries or write books about it. Publishing houses and television networks showed initial interest. But one by one, these projects were quietly killed. Why? Because several of the living descendants of the families involved, the Hartwells, distant Pemberton cousins, and others connected to the case, hired law firms to threaten legal action. They argued that publishing the details would cause distress to family members, that it would be an invasion of privacy, that the case had been sealed for 75 years precisely to protect those involved. They argued, essentially, that the truth should stay buried forever. And largely, it has. There's been minimal coverage of the Pemberton case in mainstream media. Most British people have never heard of it. The few articles that do exist are brief, sanitized, lacking in crucial details. The photographs in 1933 have never been publicly released. Many of the documents remain restricted despite the technical end of the sealing period held back through legal mechanisms and privacy claims. The establishment is still protecting itself, still ensuring that this story remains obscure, still making certain that the full horror never quite reaches public consciousness. Because if it did, if people truly understood what happened at Ashbourne Manor and how thoroughly it was covered up, they might start asking uncomfortable questions about what else has been hidden, what other horrors have been quietly buried under legal mechanisms and family embarrassment. In 2016, a historian named Dr. Sarah Whitfield at the University of Manchester attempted to write a comprehensive academic paper on the Pemberton case. She'd spent 3 years gathering documents, interviewing descendants who were willing to talk, piecing together the full picture. Her paper was rejected by every academic journal she submitted to. The rejections were polite but consistent, too sensationalistic, not enough scholarly distance, potentially litigious. One editor told her off the record that the subject matter was simply too disturbing for an academic audience, that it would reflect poorly on the journal's reputation. Whitfield posted a summary of findings on an academic blog in 2018. The blog post was removed within 72 hours following legal threats. She was warned by a university that continuing to pursue this line of research might jeopardize her position. She abandoned the project. When contacted by a journalist in 2019, she said, I learned that there are still stories we're not allowed to tell, truths that are too ugly for public consumption. The Pemberton case should be taught in every history course as an example of aristocratic abuse and institutional failure. Instead, it's been memory hold. That tells you everything about who controls historical narrative. So here we are in 2025, 92 years after the events, and this story is still being suppressed. Not through dramatic censorship, but through the quiet, persistent mechanisms of legal threat, editorial caution, and institutional reluctance. The truth exists in archives and sealed documents, but it remains largely unknown because the systems that hid it originally are still functioning, still protecting the powerful, still prioritizing reputation over revelation. Let me tell you about one more document that surfaced in 2014, because it crystallizes everything evil about this case. Among Catherine Pemberton's personal effects, held in storage by the Hartwell family estate, was a letter she'd written to her mother in 1926. The letter was discovered when the estate was being liquidated. In it, Catherine describes her plans for her daughters with chilling casualness. Edmund and I've agreed that the girls will serve the family as is proper. Eleanor will return from Switzerland next year, and by then she'll be old enough. Victoria has proven quite useful, though her spirit needed considerable breaking. Margaret is still young, but she's malleable and obedient. We shall preserve the bloodline and restore the Pemberton name to its former glory. Other families dilute themselves with common marriages. We shall concentrate our essence. In a few generations, the Pembertons will be the purest line in England. The purest line in England. She actually believed she was doing something noble. She saw her sister and her daughters as tools, as breeding stock, as means to an end. And she expressed these thoughts in a letter to her own mother, casually, as if discussing garden plans or menu selections. The banality of this evil is perhaps its most disturbing aspect. There's no evidence that Catherine's mother objected or reported these statements to anyone. The family closed ranks. That's what families like this did. That's what they still do. I've spent months researching this case, reading every document I could access, tracking down every lead. And the question that haunts me isn't, how could this happen? The answer to that is clear: it happened because multiple systems failed simultaneously, because people chose complicity over courage, because wealth and status created impunity. The question that haunts me is, how many other Ashbourne Manors were there? How many other country houses in England, in Europe, in America, concealed similar horrors behind their walls? How many other families practiced their own versions of concentrated breeding, of bloodline purity, of treating women and children as property? The Pembertons were caught because Thomas had enough conscience to run, because Reverend Blackwood was stubborn enough to push, because Inspector Hartley was honest enough to follow through. But how many families never had that convergence of circumstances? How many secrets died with the perpetrators, were buried with the victims, were successfully suppressed by complicit systems? We'll never know. The documents of Tellus have been destroyed, sealed, or hidden. The witnesses are dead. The physical evidence has been demolished or buried. History, as it's taught, is a cleaned version that admits the worst truths. But sometimes, just sometimes, cracks appear. Documents get unsealed, archives get digitized, researchers get persistent, and stories like the Pemberton case emerge from the darkness where they've been kept. These stories are gifts, in a terrible way. They're proof that our suspicions about the powerful are often too generous, not too harsh. They're evidence that the monsters we imagine lurking behind closed doors are real, and worse than we want to believe. The Pemberton case teaches us several crucial lessons. First, that evil doesn't always look like evil. Lord Edmund and Lady Catherine were by all accounts charming, educated, cultured people. They attended church, they were generous to local charities, they maintained their estate beautifully. On the surface, they were model aristocrats. But beneath that surface, they were systematically torturing and destroying human beings, including their own children. We cannot judge evil by its manners or its social standing. Second, that systems of power will always protect themselves before they protect victims. Every institution that touched the Pemberton case, the police, the medical establishment, the legal system, the government, the press, prioritized minimizing scandal over maximizing justice. The victims were secondary considerations. The reputation of the aristocratic class was the primary concern. This isn't unique to 1933. This pattern repeats throughout history and continues today whenever the powerful are threatened with accountability. Third, that silence is complicit. Every villager, every official who suspected something and said nothing bears a portion of responsibility for what happened at Ashbourne Manor. We want to believe that we would be different, that we would speak up, that we would risk everything to save innocent people. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Most people, when faced with potential consequences for speaking truth, choose self-preservation. Understanding this about human nature is essential if we want to create systems that encourage whistleblowing rather than punishing it. Fourth, that the past is never as far behind us as we'd like to believe. The mechanism it enabled the Pemberton horror are still operational. Legal systems still favor the wealthy, institutions still prioritize reputation, families still close ranks, power still corrupts. We've made progress in some areas. Women have more legal protections now, children's rights are better established, medical ethics are more robust. But the fundamental dynamics of power and secrecy remain, and where those dynamics exist, abuse flourishes. The forbidden union that doomed a bloodline wasn't just the incestuous relationships Edmund forced on his family. It was the union between power and impunity, between privilege and between respectability and evil. That union has doomed more than one bloodline. It's doomed countless victims throughout history whose names we'll never know, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose deaths were never avenged. Victoria Hartwell died in a sanatorium, having never recovered her voice. Eleanor Pemberton died institutionalized and traumatized. Margaret Pemberton haunted by nightmares of a childhood stolen. Thomas Pemberton died in a war, carrying the burden of being the truth teller no one wanted. The infants died nameless, buried without ceremony. And Lord Edmund and Lady Catherine Pemberton. They died comfortable, relatively unpunished, their reputations partially protected by the very systems they'd manipulated and abused. Is that justice? By no measure. But it is truth, and sometimes, especially when the powerful have worked so hard to hide it, truth is the only justice available to us. Telling these stories, refusing to let them be forgotten, insisting that the comfortable lies be confronted with uncomfortable facts. That's the work we can still do for victims long dead. The Pemberton case should be as well known as any historical atrocity. It should be taught as a warning about what happens when eugenic thinking meets absolute power. It should be cited whenever someone romanticizes the aristocracy or wishes for a return to traditional class structures. But it isn't. It's obscure, deliberately kept obscure, because the descendants of that world still have enough influence to keep it that way. That's why channels like this one exist. That's why we dig into archives, track down documents, piece together stories that others want to remain fragmented. Not for sensationalism, though these stories are undeniably shocking, but because truth matters, because victims deserve to be remembered, because perpetrators deserve to be exposed, even posthumously, because systems of power need to be reminded that eventually, if we're persistent enough, their secrets come to light. The walls of Ashbourne Manor are gone, but the evidence remains. The Pemberton family name has faded, but the documents survive. The establishment managed to suppress this story for decades, but they couldn't suppress it forever. Time, the great revealer, eventually exposes everything. It may take 75 years, it may take longer, but the truth has a way of surfacing, of demanding acknowledgement, of refusing to stay buried no matter how deep the grave. If you found this investigation valuable, if you believe these stories need to be told, share this video. leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Whispers of Mystery, because there are more stories like this one, more secrets that need exposing, more truths that have been hidden for far too long. The forbidden union that doomed the Pemberton bloodline was ultimately doomed itself. Edmund died insane and imprisoned. Catherine died in exile and disgrace. Their children died traumatized or killed. Their grandchildren, the products of their twisted eugenic experiment, either died in infancy or grew up never knowing their true heritage. The pure bloodline they tried to create through concentration and control instead became a line of suffering, ending in madness, death, and extinction. There's a certain poetic justice in that. Their evil consumed itself, but the cost was too high. Too many innocents suffered. Too many lives were destroyed. And the systems that enabled that destruction were never truly held accountable. They adapted, are modernized, found new ways to protect themselves. That's what we're fighting against when we tell these stories. Not just individual evil, but systematic complicity. The documents don't lie. The evidence is clear. What happened between 1918 and 1933 was a sustained campaign of abuse, rape, imprisonment, and murder carried out by two educated, wealthy aristocrats who believed their bloodline gave them the right to use their family members as breeding stock. They were aided by complicit medical professionals, enabled by economic intimidation, protected by cartilage, and shielded by a legal system that valued reputation over justice. And when it was finally exposed, the response wasn't outrage but embarrassment. Not justice but damage control. Not reform but suppression. That's the real horror. Not just what the Pembertons did, but how society responded when it was discovered. By trying to forget, to erase, to bury it all again. At this time in sealed documents and legal threats rather than in unmarked graves. We're still living with the consequences of that response. We're still living in a world where the powerful can commit atrocities and expect to be protected. Where victims can be sacrificed to preserve institutional reputation. Where truth can be sealed away for 75 years and even then, still be suppressed through legal mechanisms and editorial caution. But we're also living in a world where information is harder to control than it used to be. Where researchers can digitize documents and share them globally. Where stories can be told outside traditional gatekeepers. Where audiences exist who want to know the truth, no matter how disturbing, no matter who it offends. This is that truth. The Pemberton case, a forbidden union, a doomed bloodline, a system that failed, and a story that for 90 years but refuses to stay silent any longer. Remember these names: Victoria Hartwell, Eleanor Pemberton, Margaret Pemberton, Thomas Pemberton, the infants who died unnamed. They deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, and the evil that destroyed them deserves to be exposed, examined, and understood, so that we might recognize its patterns when they emerge again, because they will emerge again. Evil doesn't disappear. It adapts, it hides, it waits. And when we forget the lessons of cases like this one, when we let these stories fade into obscurity, we create the conditions for history to repeat itself. So remember Ashbourne Manor. Remember what happened there. Remember how it was covered up. Remember how even now, forces are working to keep this story obscure. And ask yourself what stories from our own time are being similarly suppressed. What horrors are happening behind closed doors right now? What truths are buried away for future generations to discover? The past isn't past. The victims aren't forgotten. The truth isn't buried. Not anymore. Not as long as there are people willing to dig, to investigate stories despite pressure to stay silent. That's the real defiance against systematic evil. Not dramatic resistance, but persistent revelation. Not violence, but voice. Not forgetting, but remembering. This has been Whispers of Mystery. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for helping ensure that these victims are not forgotten and these crimes are not erased. Until next time, keep investigating and keep demanding truth, no matter how deeply it's been buried.